Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session. I'm Carmen Von Rohr, Content and Digital Manager at CRF and your conference chair, and I am here with Scott Anthony, Innovation Expert, Senior Partner at growth strategy consulting firm InnoSight, and author of Eat, Sleep, Innovate, published by Harvard Business Review Press. Scott, thank you for joining us.
Carmen, thanks so much for having me. It's a thrill to be here from Singapore.
So we're here today to talk about innovation. Your new book, Eat, Sleep, Innovate, is a guide for building a culture of innovation so that behaviors that drive innovation come naturally to people, so they're an everyday habit. It's about how you release your organization's innovation energy. It's a great, really enjoyable book, and I think a good place to start is, what exactly is a culture of innovation?
Well, Carmen, you hinted at it, provided the overview of the book, but let's start by defining innovation, because if we don't have a definition for that, we can't get into a culture of innovation. We define innovation pretty simply: something different that creates value. The word something is intentionally vague. Innovation is more than new technologies. It's not just the job of the few, it's the responsibility of the many, as there are lots of different ways to innovate. We use different rather than a leap forward to remind us that while we need hypersonic planes and life-saving vaccines, we also should relish the day-to-day things that make life that much better. And creates value reminds us that the ultimate point of innovation is to achieve something, whether that's revenues, profits, employee engagement, or whatever. Until you take a spark of creativity and turn it into the creation of value, you have not innovated. So what is a culture of innovation? A culture of innovation is one in which the behaviors that allow you to repeatedly, successfully innovate come naturally. You don't have to force people to do it. You don't have to cajole them to do it. They just do it because it is the everyday habit in the organization.
Fantastic. Thank you for that overview. And I think you almost started to touch on this a little bit. Whose responsibility is it to drive innovation in an organization? Is it senior leaders or?
And of course, the response or the answer is going to be it's everybody. Now, of course, if you really are to create a culture of innovation inside a large established organization, senior leadership has a huge role to play. One of the key case studies in Eat, Sleep, Innovate is about DBS Bank in Singapore that transformed from being a laggard in its local market to being globally recognized as an innovation powerhouse. That kind of transformation does not happen unless its CEO, Piyush Gupta, is actively driving it. But that doesn't mean that you only can have this happen if you've got a CEO driving it. Innovation is something different that creates value. Everybody in an organization at every level can be looking for opportunities to do it, can create ways to encourage it. It is everyone's responsibility.
Fantastic. And so how do innovators behave?
So in the book, we list out 5 specific behaviors that can encourage innovation success. It starts with curiosity. You have to question the status quo. You can't start the quest to do something different that creates value if you don't ask questions like why and why not and what if or how might we. The next behavior is customer obsessed. If you're going to create value, you have to find a problem worth solving, what we call a job to be done. That might be for an end customer or consumer. It might be for a supplier or stakeholder. It might be for a colleague or coworker. The next key behavior is collaborative. None of us is as smart as all of us. One of the most time-tested findings in the innovation literature is that magic happens at intersections. When different mindsets and skills collide together, great innovators collaborate to come up with a spark that can turn into something different that creates value. The fourth behavior is adept in ambiguity. Every innovation idea starts its life partially right and partially wrong. The trick is you don't know which part is which. You're not going to succeed by planning and then acting. You will only succeed by testing and learning, having fumbles and false steps and the occasional failure on the path to success. The fifth and final behavior is empowered. You can't do something different that creates value unless you actually. So you have to take that precious first step so you can begin to take that spark and turn it into the creation of value.
Sorry, I'm going back to mic on, mic off so I don't create feedback. Now, you told me when we were getting ready that you could bring this to life in 2 minutes. So can we try it?
We can try it. I'm not sure if it's going to work, as I've never done exactly this before, but let's give it a whirl. So I'm curious to see if this collective group here can, in 2 minutes, come up with at least the seed of something different that creates value. So we're going to be a little bit customer obsessed, and we're going to try to get your voice into what is a problem we're solving. So we're going to cross our fingers now that this will work. We would like to open up a poll question. We'd like to open up a poll question, and we're hoping that magically we're going to see some kind of Slido code that appears on the screen. And if we don't see a Slido, oh, here we go, some magic is happening. You see there the poll question is up. You've got a QR code that you can go and hit, or go to slido.com, CRF forum, and you can answer one of the questions here. So the question is, which of these is a problem worth us working on for the next 90 seconds? Maintaining a sense of positivity and possibility when faced with what feels like a non-stop onslaught, say that 3 times fast, of negative news. Understanding customer behavior when we can't spend as much time with them as we might like. Running effective virtual brainstorming sessions. Developing effective ways to make medium-term decisions when we're faced with huge degrees of uncertainty. I bought enough time when I was reading the words on the poll that we're now getting some votes in here. And let's see what comes up as the number 1. These are all kind of everyday problems that I've curated as we've been out in the field working with organizations all around the world to help them combat some of the challenges and seize, of course, some of the opportunities created by the COVID-19 pandemic. And Carmen, maybe we'll wait about 10 more seconds and see what goes to the top. We've got one that is rising up there. Have virtual equivalents of water cooler chit chat. As I was playing around a little bit with this platform this morning, I could already feel it. I can feel the world moving in a direction where you can enable the best of both worlds. You get the convenience of being virtual, you get the benefits of being physical. All right, let's call that a close. So have virtual equivalents of water cooler chit chat. So maybe we can return to just having you and I on screen here. I guess I press this X button and I can now see myself and you. Okay, so here's the next thing we're going to do. We are going to collaborate to try and come up with an idea to do something different that creates value. Here's your task. You've got a minute. I want you to think of somebody who has solved this problem in a different place. Or if you want to quickly go on Google and look for inspiration, now is the time to do it. The goal here is to come up with a seed that you can plant in the general chat window that is an idea for how we can have virtual equivalents of water cooler chit chat. So try to think, where have you seen something like this? Maybe in a very different form of environment. Who has done something like this? Maybe something far outside of the business world. Try to stretch yourself a little bit. Think about something lateral and share any spark of an idea that comes into your head in the chat window. I see here we've got a few things here. So we've got James has already typed something in here. James, you get the prize for the fastest fingers, where we talk about VR games. So you draw an inspiration from something that's outside the business world and study. What have VR games done to encourage that type of chit chat? I've got 4 kids. The oldest is almost 15, so I have plenty of experience watching him play things like Fortnite and so on. And you can really see that as people are working or in these environments, they really have the equivalent of the loose and lazy chit chat that we would see in the old time water coolers. So it can be really powerful. I see gaming coming up here. Virtual discussion clubs on different topics, connection games at the start of a video conference. Hopeful Banana, that is one that I have never heard of before, but I think I will steal that idea shamelessly. I see a bunch of you saying that our teenagers have this sus, let's ask them. And that is one of the great things you can do for innovation. As the great science fiction writer William Gibson once said, the future's already arrived, it's just not very evenly distributed. So you find the people who've already solved the problem, which often are the kids and the hackers and the people at the edges, and say, okay, what is happening at Fortnite? Let's learn from it. Let's replicate it in a corporate environment, and we've got the beginnings of an idea. Are we done yet? Of course not. We still would have to manage the process of taking that idea and developing it and testing it, et cetera, et cetera. But you can see here in just a couple minutes, we found a problem, we came up with some interesting ideas, we got the juices flowing, and that's really all it takes to get the innovation journey started.
To unmute myself. Thank you, Scott. That was actually quite fun. So you say in the book that those behaviors don't come naturally to many organizations. What gets in the way of building a culture of innovation?
And Carmen, this goes back to the reference I made to my children. This is a puzzle I've had over the past 15 years. In that time, I've been advising organizations on topics of innovation and growth, and I've watched my 4 kids grow up. The puzzle is this. I don't have to teach my kids the behaviors that I talked about. They come naturally to them because they're children. And we enter this world curious and creative and collaborative, and people experiment. That's just the way it is. But when we get inside organizations, something seems to go wrong. Why is that? Well, it's actually not that difficult. Innovation is something different that creates value. Organizations are designed, not optimized, to do what they are currently doing more effectively and more efficiently. The biggest barrier to innovation inside most organizations is institutionalized inertia. You have ingrained habits, you have ingrained rituals, you have ingrained routines, all of which are perfectly sensible to do what you're currently doing better, all of which stand in the way of doing something different. You're on mute, Carmen. I'm not
Sorry.
a good lip reader.
So how can leaders get their people into the habits of expressing curiosity, being customer obsessed, seeking collaboration, being adept at ambiguity, and feeling empowered? Is there a tool?
That's what we would call it in my home country, the United States, a softball question. Of course there is, and it is a key part of Eat, Sleep, Innovate. I, in fact, have a printout of a piece of it right in front of me. You can see some scribbles on this as I had some feedback on it. But the tool that we have in the book is ripped straight from the habit change literature. The enemy is institutionalized inertia. You have to overcome that inertia, defeat that blocker, and encourage new behaviors. What does the habit change literature tell you to do? You've got to get the rational part of the brain, you've got to get the unconscious part of the brain. The specific tool that we have in the book is called a BEAM. The behavior enabler, the BE in the acronym, goes at the rational, logical part of your brain. It is a checklist, it's a coach, it's a ritual to help you begin to do something different. The AN stands for artifacts and nudges. Those are the indirect ways to encourage you to do new things. They're the stories or the leaderboard where you see yourself all the way down here and you say, I've got to beat my colleagues, or the visual or digital reminders of doing different things. What I have in my hands here are 101 beans that appear in the book. Let me just pick a couple of them for one of the behaviors, the behavior adept in ambiguity. The Australian software has a ritual called a pre-mortem. Before they start working on an idea, they go and look at it and say, what might happen that will cause this idea to fail? It's a great way to pressure test an idea before you do anything, to see risks, and also condition you to the reality that it is possible that ideas aren't going to work. Another one I circled that struck me before we got into this discussion is something from a company called Conductrix, which does a lot of testing related support software. They have something called best case, worst case, where they pick up an idea and say, if everything goes perfectly well, what happens? If everything's a disaster, what happens? It helps make sure that their time is focused on the ideas that have the most promise. And again, they identify the critical risks. Finally, Supercell, the Finnish gaming company that's now owned by Tencent, has a great ritual called Cheers to Failure. They're working on new games all the time. Sometimes they succeed. They launch new games successfully into the App Store, the Play Store. Everyone gets together, they crack open a beer. Sometimes they fail. They're halfway through and they say, this is never going to work out. Everyone comes together, they pop open champagne. Note the reward for the failure is greater than the reward for the success. This does two things. It says a good, not bad thing has happened. And number two, we are done with this. No zombie project that sucks the innovation life out of the organization is spawned in the effort. There are 98 other examples in the book, but you can see these are relatively straightforward things, but if you do them with diligence, do them with focus, they materially improve your ability to create a culture where these behaviors come naturally.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scott. I think we have a few minutes left and we can take some chat. You can put your questions, we can take some Q&A from the audience. I see a couple in the chat. And I think, Scott, your example just spoke to this a little bit, but Wendy asks, why do we make people feel they can't do this at work? Isn't the blocker just senior people frowning on chat? So maybe you could expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, and Wendy, if I had a little bit more time, I would tell you a story that appears in chapter 2 of the book that talks about my now 9-year-old boy, Harry, and something that happened with him in Singapore. You got to read the book to figure out what the story is. But the general point is, we punish people who try things. That is the basic issue that we face inside many organizations. And of course, once people recognize that trying something at best has no upside and at worst leads to punishment, people aren't going to do anything. That's not to say necessarily that we want a lot of failure. We only want a certain type of failure, what Harvard Business School professor Amy Edmondson calls an intelligent failure. When we couldn't have known beforehand, so like a good scientist, We picked out the key assumptions. We found a good way to test them. We test in a focused way. We bounded the risk, and we learned something from the experiment. This is exactly what a scientist would do. And if a scientist disproves a hypothesis, as long as they didn't blow up the laboratory, this is a good, not bad result. But inside far too many organizations, we penalize people for intelligent failure. Of course, it's more complicated than this. There's a bunch of stuff you have to work on. But if there is one area on which to focus, you ask yourself, what happens to people who take well thought out risks that don't pan out? And if those people are never heard from again, you probably ought to go work on that.
So another question coming through here, success is not a linear straight line journey. Are business people patient enough to get through the messy middle?
Yeah, so Nigel, I think that's a great question as well. Some are, some aren't. And you have here one of the most persistent and most damaging myths that many senior leaders tell themselves, that the only thing my shareholders care about is short-term returns. It's not true, and it is a dangerous blocker to innovating at scale, because the research shows very clearly, done by McKinsey and others, that the number one way to generate short-term returns, is to have a long-term orientation. Therefore, paradoxically, if you focus on optimizing the short term, you destroy short-term value. So those who think about it the right way can tolerate the messy middle. I saw a comment here about Amazon.com and how there's a recognition that a lot of experiments aren't going to work out, and that's okay, because the ones that do, they make up for all the ones that didn't work. This is the way one of our clients once framed it to us. They said, when I'm working on innovation, I'm going to place a bet. The best thing that happens, I get an entirely new platform or ecosystem. The worst thing that happens, I write off the bet. I don't invest in innovation. My upside is capped at 0. The downside is I go and bankrupt the company. So what is the risky thing? The risk is not innovating. The risk is to not innovate. That's what can kill you.
Thank you, Scott. I think we have time for one or two more questions, and something I see in the chat is Lorna mentioning that there is a gender dimension to taking risk. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it is a great question. I have not studied, nor have I read studies that look at gender disparities in risk-taking, but I think there has been research that shows some of the mindsets and approaches that tend to be more biased towards females are very aligned with what is required to drive innovation success. And I'm just struck, if you look at a lot of the emerging work around how you create the kind of environments where people would have a growth mindset, you have people like Carol Dweck, you have people like Amy Edmondson, you have people like Rita McGrath, you have people like Francesca Gino, you notice a common element here, you have people like Brene Brown, all the people who are pushing how you create an environment that enables this, they're all female. And that might just be random, I don't know, but there's something interesting in all of that that is worth more study and worth more discussion. And look, one of the key things you need to innovate is you need to collaborate, which means you don't just need diversity, you need to have inclusivity too, because you cannot collaborate unless there is trust-based inclusivity. Without that, as Francis Fry from the Harvard Business School has noted, you just go to the lowest common denominator. So diversity actually carries a penalty. You get diversity plus inclusivity, you get the diversity dividend, it spurs innovation, it's a powerful thing for your organization, but you need to have both.
Thank you, Scott. I think we are almost out of time, so I'd like to end by asking you, do you have any parting words of advice for us?
Well, my parting words of advice will not come from me. They're going to come from Ed Catmull. So Ed Catmull is the co-founder, along with Steve Jobs, of Pixar, and I'm just thrilled that he actually wrote an endorsement for the book, and I think he captures what we meant to do in the book perfectly. If you want to unleash more creativity in your organization, you can't simply tell people what you want. You need to create a culture that emboldens them to behave like innovators, and you need to trust that this is what they want to do. The innovation potential exists inside your organization. You have in your organization the curious Charlies, the hopeful Hollies, the happy Harrys, the thoughtful Teddies. Those are my 4 kids. My job as a parent is to make sure those kids never lose their love of learning. My job as an advisor is to help you and people like you to release, harness, and amplify the latent innovation energy that lies within. It's there, and we have never needed it more. So we can all innovate, not to the new normal, that's kind of depressing, not to the new abnormal, that's even more depressing, but to the new better. Thank you very much, and good luck.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott, so much for your time and for joining us today. It's been a really engaging session. And to everyone who joined us, thank you also for your time. Please do visit the Harvard Business Review's virtual stand for more information about Eat, Sleep, Innovate. And do look out for a summary and recording of our session in the conference retrospective, which will be emailed to you all later this week. Thank you.